My grandfather looked at me from the hospital lobby chair, his hands folded over a small paper bag of medications, and before I could even say hello, he leaned close and whispered 5 words that changed everything. "Don't take me home." I thought I'd misheard him. I hadn't. What came next would unravel a secret my own family had been hiding for months. The message came through at 0640 while I was standing in a supply line checking equipment with my platoon. My phone buzzed against my hip and I almost ignored it. We don't check phones during formation. But something made me glance down. "Your grandfather is being discharged today. Can you pick him up?" It was from my mother. No explanation, no context. Just that sitting there on a screen while I stood in the Georgia heat with 40 pounds of gear on my back. I typed back one word, "Dad." She didn't answer for almost 20 minutes. When she finally did, it wasn't an answer at all. "He said he's busy. Can you handle it?" I stared at that sentence longer than I should have. My father lived 11 minutes from the hospital. I was over 3 hours away in the middle of a training rotation I couldn't just walk off of. But I called him anyway because something about the silence around this felt wrong before I even knew why. "Dad, I'm at Benning. I can't just leave post." "Well, somebody needs to get him," he said like I was the one being unreasonable. "I've got a thing with work. Linda's got her hair appointment. You know how she gets if she cancels." A hair appointment. My grandfather, 82 years old, recovering from a fall that put him in the hospital for 4 days, and the reason my father couldn't drive 11 minutes was a hair appointment he wasn't even having. Linda was. I called Daniel next. My younger brother picked up on the second ring already talking before I could ask. "Look, I've got a shift I can't just bail. They'll write me up." "It's Grandpa Daniel." I know, but I really can't right now." I hung up and sat with that for a moment, my thumb hovering over Carol's name. My cousin was the one who usually handled things like this. She brought him groceries, drove him to appointments, sat with him on Sundays. If anyone would go, it was her. She answered on the first ring, which should have told me something. "Margaret, I can't drive that far today. I've got the kids, and honestly, hospitals stress me out." Nobody could do it. Not one person in a family of 4 adults living within a 30-minute radius of that hospital could find an hour to bring an old man home. I looked at the mission board pinned outside our company office. I looked at the CO's door. And then I did something I don't do lightly. I asked to speak with him off the record, explained the situation in the fewest words possible because that's how you talk to a commander who respects efficiency. He looked at me for a second, then said, "Finish the equipment check, sign off with your platoon sergeant, and go. Family comes first when it's real. This sounds real." It took me 4 hours to drive there. I didn't stop except for gas. I kept running numbers in my head, miles, minutes, the last time I'd actually sat across from my grandfather instead of talking to him for 6 minutes on the phone during a drive somewhere. It had been longer than I wanted to admit. When I walked into that hospital lobby, I saw him before he saw me. He was sitting near the window in a wheelchair he clearly didn't need anymore. A small paper bag of prescriptions in his lap, his jacket buttoned wrong on one side. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not frail exactly. George Hayes had never been frail a day in his life, not the man who built half the roads in that county with his own hands. But diminished somehow, like something had been pulled out of him that hadn't gone back in yet. Then he saw me and his whole face changed. "I knew you'd come," he said, and his voice cracked in a way I'd never heard before. I crouched down next to the wheelchair and squeezed his hand. "Of course I came, Grandpa. Let's get you home." He didn't answer that. He just nodded slow and let me help him stand, one arm looped through mine, his grip tighter than I expected for a man his age. I signed the discharge paperwork, thanked the nurse, and walked him out to the truck, matching his pace, which had gotten noticeably slower since the last time I'd seen him walk anywhere. I got him settled in the passenger seat, buckled him in like he was a kid again, and pulled out of the parking lot toward the highway that led back to his house. The house he'd lived in for over 50 years. The house my father grew up in. We were maybe 10 minutes down the road, the radio playing low, when I noticed him watching the side mirror, then the rear view. Then he leaned toward me closer than a man usually leans unless something is wrong, and his voice dropped to barely more than a breath. "Don't take me home." I glanced at him, certain I'd misunderstood. "What?" He looked straight ahead now, jaw-tight, hands folded in his lap like he was holding something in. "Take me to a lawyer." I felt my grip shift on the steering wheel. "Grandpa, why?" He turned to me then, and there was something in his eyes I'd never seen on him before. Not confusion, not fear exactly, but the look of a man who had been waiting a long time to say something out loud. "Because if I go home tonight," he said quietly, "I may never get another chance to tell you the truth." I didn't press him, not right away. Whatever he needed to say, it clearly wasn't something he wanted to say at 65 miles an hour on a highway with his hands shaking in his lap. So I did the only thing that made sense. I found the nearest exit, pulled into a gas station, and just sat there with him for a minute in the quiet. "Grandpa, talk to me when you're ready. I'm not going anywhere." He nodded, staring out the windshield at nothing in particular, and after a long moment he said, "Not here. Somewhere with a bed. I haven't slept right in 4 days." That I could do. I found a small hotel about 15 minutes from a law office I remembered him mentioning years ago. Eleanor Brooks, a name that had come up at holidays, sometimes always in the context of your grandmother's will, or the trust papers. It was too late in the day to go there, directly past 5 now, so I got him a room-ordered soup from the diner next door, because it was the only thing on the menu that looked like something his stomach could handle, and sat with him while he ate. He was quiet for a long time. Then somewhere between the soup and the second cup of decaf, it started coming out. "Your father came by the house a few weeks back," he said, "before all this." He gestured vaguely at himself at the hospital bracelet still on his wrist. "Said I couldn't keep living alone. Said it was time to think about assisted living." I kept my face neutral. "What did you say?" "I said I'd think about it. Seemed reasonable enough at the time. I'm 82, Margaret. I know I'm not going to live in that house forever." He turned the coffee cup slowly on the table, not drinking it. But then he came back a few days later with papers, lots of papers. Said I just needed to sign so they could help manage things. Something in my chest went very still. "Did you sign them?" "No." He said it firmly, like the one thing in this whole mess he was certain of. I didn't understand half of what they said. Didn't like that he wanted me to sign before I'd even read it properly. I told him I needed time. He paused. "Next day I fell in the kitchen, hit my head on the counter, woke up in that hospital bed. I didn't say what I was thinking. I didn't say it out loud, not yet, because it was too early, too speculative, and I've learned in 12 years of service that jumping to conclusions before you have facts gets people hurt sometimes, literally. But the timeline sat in my stomach like a stone. The next morning I called Eleanor Brooks. Her office could see us at 11. She was older than I expected, sharp-eyed, maybe 70, with the kind of quiet, unhurried manner of someone who had spent decades listening to people's worst family moments and learned not to react to any of them on the surface. She greeted my grandfather warmly like an old friend, which apparently he was. "George, it's been a while." She looked at me. "And you must be Margaret. I remember you from your grandmother's service." We sat down across from her desk, and she pulled a thick folder from a locked cabinet behind her. "So," she said, opening it, "let's start with what I have on file. You've got a revocable living trust from about 8 years ago. A power of attorney, naming Richard as your agent in case of incapacity, and a will that splits the estate between Richard and Daniel, with a smaller provision for you, Margaret, and for Carol." She looked up. "That's the last version I have on record." "That sounds right," George said. "But," Eleanor set down a second, thinner folder. "A colleague of mine at the county recorder's office flagged something for me 2 days ago. A new document was filed. Recently, it restructures how certain assets are held, including potentially the house." My stomach tightened. "Did Grandpa sign them?" "That's what I need to find out." Eleanor slid a photocopy across the desk. "This is the signature page." George reached for it, slowly adjusting his glasses, and stared at the looping signature at the bottom of the page for a long moment. The room was quiet, except for the hum of the office air conditioning. Then he set the paper down, and when he looked up at me, his face had gone pale in a way that had nothing to do with his 4 days in a hospital bed. "That's not my signature." I looked down at the page again at the name George Hayes written in ink that was supposed to be his on a document he apparently never saw filed sometime while he was recovering from a fall that had happened one day after he refused to sign the very same kind of paperwork. I didn't say anything. I didn't trust myself to. Eleanor watched us both carefully, the way I imagined she'd watched 100 families before us, sitting in those same chairs right before everything they thought they knew about each other started coming apart. Eleanor didn't let the moment sit for long. She'd clearly seen shock before, and she knew the difference between giving someone space to feel it and letting them drown in it. "I want to be careful here," she said, closing the thinner folder but keeping it close. "A signature that doesn't look right isn't proof of anything on its own. People's handwriting changes. Stress changes it. Age changes it." She looked at George with something like gentleness. "But given what you've just told me, and given the timing, I think we need to treat this seriously." "How seriously?" and I asked. "If that signature is forged, we're not talking about a family disagreement anymore. We're talking about fraud." elder financial exploitation, possibly unauthorized use of a power of attorney if someone acted outside the scope of what your grandfather actually authorized. She said the words plainly without drama, the way you'd read off a checklist. I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm saying it's what we need to rule in or rule out. George sat very still through all of it, his hands folded in his lap, staring at a spot on Eleanor's desk, like it might give him an answer neither of us could. I don't want to think it was Richard, he said quietly. He's my son. I know, Eleanor said. And we're not accusing anyone yet. We're gathering facts. That's all this is right now. I asked her what came next and she laid it out. Pull the full notary record for the new filing request bank, and property records cross-reference the timeline with the hospital admission. It would take a few days. In the meantime, she suggested George stay somewhere quiet, somewhere he could rest without pressure, and that I not say anything to the family about where he was. Not because you're hiding something wrong, she clarified, seeing the look on my face. Because if there is something wrong, the people involved need to not know we're looking yet. I drove back to base that afternoon once George was settled, my mind running through the conversation on a loop the whole way. When my rotation wrapped 2 days later, I went home to my parents' house, the one I'd grown up in 20 minutes from George's. My father was waiting on the porch before I'd even turned off the engine. That told me something too. He didn't wait on porches for anyone. Where is your grandfather? He didn't say hello, didn't ask how the drive was. He's safe, I said, getting out of the truck. Safe where Margaret, he needs to be home. He needs his routine, his doctor's nearby. He's safe, Dad. That's all I'm going to say right now. Something flickered across his face. Not sadness, not concern, something closer to alarm. What did he tell you? I watched him carefully. Why does it matter what he told me? Because he's confused, Margaret. He fell and hit his head. Old men say things after a fall like that. You can't take everything he says as gospel. I hadn't told him anything about signatures, forged documents, or lawyers. I hadn't told him a single specific detail. And yet here was my father unprompted already building a case for why his own father's memory couldn't be trusted. I never said he told me anything specific, I said slowly. My father's jaw tightened, and for just a second, less than a second, really something crossed his face that I can only describe as fear. Then it was gone, replaced by frustration, the kind he'd always used to end conversations he didn't like. You're putting ideas in his head. You show up once every few months and suddenly you know what's best for this family. I didn't answer that. I didn't need to. I just looked at him the same way Eleanor had looked at both of us across her desk. Steady, quiet, gathering information instead of giving it away. 3 days later, Eleanor called. I drove out to her office that evening. I pulled the notarization records, she said, sliding a page across the desk. The new document was notarized on the 14th, filed with the county on the 16th. Okay, I said, what's on it? Richard is named as financial manager with expanded authority. Several assets, including funds previously held solely by your grandfather, were restructured into a newly formed LLC. She paused. And the house, George's house, it's listed as a related asset within that same structure. I felt something settle in my chest, cold and heavy. But Grandpa says he never agreed to any of this. He didn't, Eleanor said. I believe him, and I think you do too. She leaned back, slightly studying me the way she had that first day, like she was deciding how much weight I could carry. Margaret, she said finally, I don't think your grandfather asked you to pick him up because he was afraid to be alone. She pushed the folder toward me, its edges lined up perfectly straight, like everything else about her. I think he asked you because he knew you were the only person in this family he could still trust. I didn't sleep much that week. Not because of anything dramatic, no confrontations, no shouting matches, nothing that would make for an easy story. Just the quiet, grinding work of trying to understand a family I thought I already knew. I started with Daniel. Not because I suspected him of anything, but because he was the one person in the family who'd never learned to hide what he was feeling. I called him under the pretense of catching up, and it didn't take long before he mentioned almost in passing that he'd taken out a loan a few months back that hadn't gone the way he planned. It's fine, he said quickly, the way people say things when they're not fine. Dad's helping me sort it out. Helping how? I don't know, Margaret, just helping, like he always does. A pause. Why does it matter? It mattered because 2 days earlier, Eleanor had shown me an email pulled from a shared family cloud account. George still had access to one Richard apparently forgot, still synced to his father's old laptop. The email was from Richard to Carol, sent 4 months ago, 2 lines, nothing else. Once Dad moves, we can finally settle the property issue. Don't mention anything to him yet. Let's wait until the assisted living conversation is further along. Settle the property issue. Not make sure Dad's comfortable. Not figure out his care. The property issue. I thought about every time over the past year my father had brought up assisted living, always with the same tone, always framed as concern. I thought about Carol, who visited George every week with groceries and warm conversation, and who had also, according to the notary logs Eleanor pulled, been present at the office where the disputed document was filed. Present, but not as a witness, as the one who dropped it off. Everyone kept saying the same thing in different words. We're just trying to help Grandpa. But grocery runs don't restructure a man's assets into an LLC. Warm conversation doesn't file paperwork with a signature nobody remembers signing. I went to see my father again alone this time. No audience, no porch theatrics. I found him in his garage, going through old tools like he always did when he needed something to do with his hands. Did Grandpa authorize the new documents? I asked. No preamble. I'd learned by now that giving him room to build a story first only made it harder to get a straight answer later. He didn't look up right away. He turned a wrench over in his hand, set it down, picked up another one. You have no idea what this family has done for you, he said finally. Every opportunity you've had. That's not what I asked. The silence stretched longer than I expected. Long enough that I almost repeated the question. Then he set the second wrench down too and looked at me for the first time since I'd walked in. He was confused, Richard said. 4 words. Quiet ones. But I understood immediately what they were doing, not answering my question, but laying groundwork. If George could be framed as confused, unreliable, a man whose memory couldn't be trusted after a fall, then any objection he raised later could be dismissed before it was even heard. It wasn't a defense. It was a strategy. He's not confused, Dad. He remembers exactly what he did and didn't sign. You weren't there, Margaret. You don't get to decide that from 3 hours away. I'm here now. He didn't have anything to say to that. He just looked away, back down at his tools, like the conversation had ended whether he wanted it to or not. I drove back to the hotel that evening where George was still staying quieter than he liked, but safer than home. I hadn't told him everything yet, not the email, not the LLC, not the conversation in the garage. I didn't want to hand him more weight than he could carry in one sitting. He'd already lost enough sleep that week. My phone rang just as I pulled into the parking lot. Eleanor, I found something else, she said, and I could hear something different in her voice. Not alarm exactly, but the careful control of someone delivering news they know is going to matter. What? The original deed to your grandfather's house doesn't say what your father thinks it says. I sat there in the truck engine offhand, still on the wheel, waiting for her to explain, but she didn't nod over the phone. Come by the office tomorrow morning, she said. You'll want to see this in person. Eleanor's office smelled like coffee and old paper when I walked in the next morning, the kind of smell that comes from decades of filing cabinets nobody's thrown out. She had 3 folders lined up on her desk, already edges squared, waiting. Sit, she said. This is going to take a minute to explain properly. I sat. She opened the first folder, the county property record for George's house, the one he'd lived in since before my father was born. Your grandfather is still the sole legal owner of that house, she said. Full stop. Whatever your father believes, whatever assumptions have been made in that family about who controls what, the deed has never changed. Richard was never granted ownership. Not partial, not full. So the new document doesn't actually transfer ownership. It couldn't legally not with a forged or improperly executed signature. What it does is create the appearance of authority. If nobody challenges it, if George doesn't have someone in his corner who knows how to read these things, that appearance can start functioning like reality. People stop asking questions. Decisions get made. Money moves. She tapped the folder. This is why they needed the signature in the first place. Without it, they have nothing. I felt something in me settle, slightly relief. Maybe that George hadn't already lost the one thing he'd spent his whole working life building. But it didn't last long, because Eleanor opened the second folder. Here's where it gets more complicated, she said. I pulled this from a contact I have who does title work. Someone submitted a mortgage application using your grandfather's property as collateral, filed 6 weeks ago. I stared at the paper in front of me, George's name, George's address, a loan amount that made my stomach turn, and a signature at the bottom that looked exactly like the one on the estate documents, which was to say nothing like George's actual signature. He didn't apply for a mortgage, I said. It wasn't a question. No, he didn't. Someone used his information, his social security number, his property, quite possibly a signature they'd already practiced forging on the first document, to attempt to borrow against a house they didn't own and didn't have legal authority over. Eleanor folded her hands. That's not a family disagreement anymore, Margaret. That's identity misuse. That's a crime. I wanted to drive straight to my father's house. I wanted to put the papers on his kitchen table and ask him to explain right there face to face, no more garage tools to hide behind. Every instinct I had, the same instincts that had gotten me through firefights and convoy ambushes, was telling me to move, to confront, to force the truth out into the open before it could hide again. Eleanor must have seen it on my face because she reached across the desk and put her hand flat on the folder like she was holding it. And me still. "Don't accuse anyone until we have the records," she said. "I mean that. Not because I don't believe you, and not because I think your father's innocent. I mean it because the moment you accuse someone without proof, they get to control the story. Right now, we control it. Facts first, emotions second. That's how you win something like this, not by being right, but by being unshakable." It was the kind of thing my old drill sergeant used to say, dressed up in different words. Facts first. I'd built an entire career on that principle. It felt strange and oddly comforting to hear it applied here in a quiet law office to my own family. So we did it her way. Over the next 4 days, we gathered everything methodically: bank records showing the flow of funds tied to Daniel's loan property, records confirming George's uncontested ownership, notary logs, hospital admission and discharge times, copies of both the disputed estate document and the mortgage application side by side. And that was where the real crack appeared. The notary record for the estate document listed a signing date and time, a Tuesday afternoon, 3:15. Eleanor cross-referenced it against George's hospital chart, which she'd obtained with his written consent. At 3:15 that Tuesday, George Hayes was lying in a hospital bed connected to a monitor 12 miles away from the notary's office listed on the form. He could not have been in two places at once. He could not have signed anything at that office at that time because he wasn't there. He was recovering from a fall that had happened coincidentally, or not exactly, one day after he'd refused to sign similar paperwork at home. I stared at the two documents laid side by side on Eleanor's desk, the hospital timestamp and the notary date, and understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that someone hadn't just forged a signature. Someone had lied about where my grandfather was on one of the worst days of his life and used that lie to make a theft look like a signature. Eleanor called the meeting for a Saturday afternoon at her office on neutral ground. She said it needed to happen somewhere formal, somewhere that reminded everyone this wasn't a kitchen table conversation anymore. I picked George up from the hotel that morning. He'd put on a collared shirt, the kind he used to wear to church, and when I asked if he was ready, he just nodded once and said, "Past time." My parents arrived first, Daniel a few minutes after Carol, last sliding into the office, looking like she already knew something was wrong, but wasn't sure what. They took seats around Eleanor's conference table, and I watched my father's face as he registered that this wasn't going to be the conversation he expected. I think he believed he was walking into a meeting where I'd be asked to apologize, where the family would gently explain that I'd overreacted, that George was fine, that it was time to bring him home and put this behind us. He had that look, the confident, slightly impatient look of a man expecting to win. "This is a family matter," he said, before Eleanor had even finished sitting down. "I don't understand why we need a lawyer's office for this." "No," Eleanor said, calm and unhurried, opening the first folder. The moment financial documents were falsified, it stopped being just a family matter. The room went very still. She laid the papers out one at a time, methodically, the way she'd laid them out for me days earlier. The original deed showing George as sole owner. The new document showing the restructured LLC. The hospital records showing George's location at the exact time he was supposedly signing papers across town. The notary log with its impossible timestamp. The mortgage application with its forged signature. And finally the email, Richard's own words, printed out and placed last. Like the period at the end of a very long sentence. "Once Dad moves, we can finally settle the property issue." Richard read it. I watched him read it. His jaw worked, but nothing came out. "Dad," Daniel's voice cracked slightly, and he turned in his chair, staring at our father with an expression I'd never seen on my brother before. Not anger exactly, more like the floor had opened under him. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything that wasn't going to happen eventually," Richard said, too fast, the words tumbling out before he could organize them into something more defensible. "He can't manage that house alone anymore. Someone had to make decisions. Someone had to forge his signature." Daniel's voice rose. "Someone had to take out a loan using his name while he was in the hospital." Richard's composure cracked further. He turned toward Carol. "You handled the notary appointment. You were supposed to make sure everything was— I did what you told me to do. Carol snapped back, her face flushing. You said he'd already agreed. You said it was just a formality. I never said that. You absolutely said that, Richard. My mother, who had been silent the entire time, hands folded tightly in her lap, finally spoke, and her voice was thick. I didn't know about any of this. I swear I didn't know. I believed her mostly. She'd always been the kind of person who preferred not to ask too many questions about things that made her uncomfortable, which wasn't the same as innocence, but wasn't the same as guilt either. Through all of it, George sat quietly at the head of the table, watching his son, his granddaughter, his niece, and his daughter-in-law come apart in real time. He hadn't said a word since we'd walked in. When he finally did, the room went silent immediately, like it understood instinctively that this was the voice that mattered most. I spent my whole life building that house. He said, his voice steady despite everything. Poured the foundation myself one summer back when I could still lift concrete without my back giving out. Raised my son in it, buried my wife from it. He looked around the table, slowly meeting each set of eyes in turn. I never imagined I'd have to protect it from my own family. Nobody had an answer for that. Not Richard, not Carol, not anyone. Eleanor let the silence sit for a moment before she reached into the last folder on the table, one she hadn't opened yet. There's one more thing Margaret doesn't know, she said. I looked at her and something in her tone made my chest tighten. What? She pulled out a single document, old and slightly yellowed at the edges, clearly older than anything else on the table. Your grandfather changed his estate plan 6 months ago, she said. Before any of this happened, before the hospital, before the disputed documents, before any of it. I turned to George. He was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not guilt, not triumph, something quieter than either. Grandpa? He didn't answer right away. He just reached over and put his hand over mine on the table the way he used to when I was small and scared of something in the dark. We'll talk about it Sunday, he said. Just the two of us. There's something you need to hear and this isn't the room for it. Sunday came slow. George had asked me to pick him up in the morning. No explanation, just a time and a request that I come alone. I found him waiting on the porch of a house he'd finally been cleared to return to. Eleanor had spent the week working with the district attorney's office on the mortgage fraud and forged signature, and while the legal process would take months to fully resolve, George's ownership had never been in question. The house was his. It always had been. He looked better than he had in weeks, color back in his face, steadier on his feet. He'd made coffee, which surprised me. I hadn't seen him cook or prepare anything for himself since before the hospital. We sat on the porch, the same porch he used to sit on with my grandmother. 2 mugs between us, and for a while neither of us said anything. That was fine. Some of the best conversations I've had in my life started with a long, comfortable silence first. You want to know about the estate plan? He said eventually. Not a question. Only if you want to tell me. He smiled a little at that. That's exactly why I'm telling you. He explained it slowly, the way he explained things when he wanted to make sure I understood not just the what, but the why. 6 months ago, after my grandmother's second cousin passed, and left a mess of an estate behind, family fighting over furniture, over money, over who visited more in the final years, George had sat with his own mortality in a way he hadn't before. He went to Eleanor and asked her to help him think it through properly. I didn't change anything because I loved you more than your father or your brother, he said. I want you to hear that clearly. This isn't a story about favorites. Then what is it about? He turned his mug slowly in his hands the way he used to turn tools over when he was thinking. For 6 months I watched how everyone talked to me, he said. Your father called every week, every single week like clockwork, and every call somewhere in the first 5 minutes he'd bring up the house. Whether I'd thought more about assisted living, whether I'd looked at listing it, whether I'd talked to anyone about simplifying things. He shook his head slightly. Carol was kind to me. She really was. But even her visits started turning into conversations about paperwork, about power of attorney, about making things easier down the road. And Daniel needed things, money mostly, and I don't blame him for that. He's had a hard few years. But every conversation eventually got there too. He looked at me, then steady, the same look he'd given me across the truck that first day. You never asked me for anything, Margaret. Not once in 6 months. You called to ask if I was eating enough. You asked about my knee, about whether the medication was working, about some show you thought I'd like. You never once asked what would happen to this house. I felt my throat tighten and I didn't trust my voice enough to say anything right away. Everyone else asked what would happen to the house, he said quietly. You were the only one who asked if I was eating enough. We sat with that for a while. The legal outcome when it came was almost secondary to that moment, though it mattered, of course it mattered. The forged documents were voided. The mortgage application was flagged as fraudulent and stopped before any funds were released. Eleanor worked with the DA's office on the broader pattern of exploitation, and whatever consequences followed for Richard and Carol would play out through channels far more formal than a family dinner table. George kept full control of everything that was rightfully his. That part of the story ended the way it should have. But it wasn't the ending that mattered most to me. A few days later, I went to see my father. Not to gloat, not to punish him further than the situation already had, just to say something I needed him to hear clearly once. "I didn't take Grandpa away from you," I told him. He didn't look at me. He was sitting at his kitchen table, the same table where I'd eaten 1,000 dinners growing up, looking older than I'd ever seen him look. "You pushed him away," I said, "when you treated his home like it already belonged to you." He didn't have an answer. I hadn't expected one. Weeks later, George and I sat on that same porch again, the evening cooling around us, the kind of quiet that only exists in a house that finally feels safe. He asked me, almost teasing, if I knew why he'd asked me to take him to a lawyer that day instead of home. "Because you knew I wouldn't ask questions until you were ready," I said. He shook his head, smiling. "No, because you were the only person I knew would take me somewhere safe without asking what you'd get in return." I looked out at the house, the roof he'd built himself one summer, the porch steps he'd repaired every few years without ever complaining about it, the whole quiet, solid weight of a life spent building something worth protecting. I realized then that the biggest secret in this whole story was never really about money or property or who owned what. It was about who still showed up when there was nothing to gain from it. I drove 190 miles that day because my grandfather needed a ride. I didn't know I was driving him toward the truth. If this story moved you, I'd love to know where it found you. Drop a comment below and tell me, are you the one in your family who always shows up? No questions asked. We've got so many more stories like this one to share with you, so make sure you subscribe and never miss a moment like this again. Let's keep this journey going together.